poor soldier saved the Duke's daughter from assassins. She refuses to leave his cabin. The blood on his hands was not his own. Thomas Alder knew this because his own blood had long since dried. In the trenches outside Toulouse, on the frozen banks of the Nivelle, in the mud of a field hospital where a surgeon with whiskey on his breath had pulled a French musket ball from his left shoulder and told him he would never raise a sword again. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years, 4 months, and an unknowable number of sleepless nights. He had stopped counting the nights. A man who counts his suffering has not yet accepted it. But the blood now pooling between his fingers, soaking into the rough wool of his coat sleeve, belonged to a man who had died with an expression of surprise still clinging to his face, as though being stabbed through the ribs by a one-armed former infantryman in the middle of a dark Hertfordshire forest was not the way he had expected his Tuesday evening to proceed. Thomas let the body fall. The knife remained in his hand. Somewhere behind him, through the tangle of black oak and the low fog that clung to the earth like a second skin, a woman was breathing in short, desperate gasps. The kind of breathing that precedes either a scream or a collapse. He turned. She was pressed against a birch tree, her gown torn at the hem, one shoe missing, her dark hair unpinned and falling over her shoulders in a manner that, under any other circumstance, would have been considered scandalous. Her eyes were wide, fixed upon him with a particular terror of someone who cannot yet determine whether the man standing before her is salvation or merely a different kind of danger. "There are 2 more," Thomas said, his voice low, stripped of ceremony. "Can you run?" She stared at him. Then she looked down at the dead man. Then she looked back at Thomas, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A calculation, a decision made in the space between 2 heartbeats. "Yes," she said. He did not offer his hand. She did not wait for him to. They ran. The forest at night was not the gentle, poetic woodland of landscape paintings. It was a living thing, hostile and indifferent, full of roots designed to break ankles and branches that struck like open hands across the face. Thomas moved through it with the instinct of a man who had lived in its margins for 2 years, knew its ridges, its hollows, the places where the canopy thinned, and moonlight touched the ground like silver on dark water. The woman behind him kept pace with a determination that surprised him. He could hear her stockinged foot striking stone and twig without so much as a whimper. He filed this observation away as something significant. His cabin appeared through the trees the way it always did, like an afterthought. A structure so modest, so deliberately forgettable, that it seemed less built than grown from the earth itself. Stone walls, a thatched roof patched with moss, a single window with a shutter that no longer closed properly. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. The fire he had left banked before stepping out to check his traps. He pushed open the door and stood aside. She hesitated on the threshold. He understood. A woman of obvious breeding, alone, entering the home of a strange man in the dead of night. The implications were not lost on either of them. "I have a bolt on the inside of the door," he said quietly. and I will sleep outside if you require it." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. He knew what she saw. A man of perhaps 30, though the lines around his eyes suggested older. A jaw shadowed with several days' growth, clothes that had been mended so many times they were more thread than original cloth. A left arm that hung slightly lower than the right, the shoulder beneath it carrying the memory of ruin. Nothing in his appearance that would recommend him to anyone. And yet she stepped inside. The cabin was a single room, a cot pushed against one wall, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a fireplace that provided both warmth and light, and the means to cook whatever rabbit or pheasant the forest offered, a shelf holding 4 books, a tin of tea, and a jar of preserves given to him by the vicar's wife the previous autumn out of what Thomas suspected was equal parts Christian charity and pity. The entire space could have fit inside the foyer of any respectable home in England. He watched her take inventory of it, watched her eyes move across the sparse possessions of a man who had been systematically stripped of everything: rank, health, fortune, purpose, until what remained was this: a roof, a fire, a knife, and the quiet stubbornness to keep breathing. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. He crouched before the fire and coaxed it back to life, adding wood until the flames cast a warm, unsteady glow across the stone walls. Then he filled a kettle and hung it on the hook above the hearth. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice had steadied. It carried the particular cadence of someone who had been raised to speak as though the world were listening. "No one of consequence," he said without turning around. "You killed a man. Yes, and the others, the other 2, they will come looking. Not tonight. They will not risk the forest in darkness without their tracker." He paused. That was their tracker. Silence settled between them, textured and heavy, filled with the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind moving through high branches. Thomas poured tea into the only cup he owned and brought it to her. Their fingers did not touch in the exchange, though the space between them seemed to contract. "My name," she said, wrapping both hands around the cup as though it were the most precious object she had ever held, "is Eleanor Whitcomb." He knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. The Duke of Ashworth's daughter. The most protected, most scrutinized, most politically valuable young woman in the southern half of England. The woman whose hand in marriage had been the subject of drawing-room speculation from London to Bath for the better part of 2 seasons. Thomas said nothing. "You know who I am," she observed. "I know who your father is." "That is not the same thing." He looked at her then, and something passed between them that neither would have been able to name. A recognition perhaps of 2 people who understood what it meant to be defined by circumstances they had not chosen. "No," he agreed, "it is not." He told her what he could determine. 3 men, well armed, had been following her through the forest, not the actions of common thieves who would have ambushed and been done with it, but a pursuit with purpose and patience. Professional men, men who had been paid. This meant organization. This meant someone with resources wanted Lady Eleanor Whitcomb either captured or dead, and had invested considerable money in ensuring it. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she set the teacup down on the table with a steadiness that contradicted the slight tremor in her lower lip. "My father's secretary," she said, "Mr. Hale. He arranged my departure from the estate tonight. He told me a carriage would be waiting at the North Road to take me to my aunt's home in Suffolk. He said there had been threats, that I would be safer away from Ashworth Park until certain political matters were resolved. And you trusted him. I have known him since I was 11 years old." Thomas absorbed this. The carriage was not there. No. And instead 3 armed men appeared from the tree line. Yes. He stood and moved to the window, peering through the gap in the shutter at the darkness beyond. The forest was still. Whatever creatures inhabited it had gone silent, as creatures do when the presence of men has disturbed the natural order of things. "Then you cannot return to your father's house," he said. "Not yet. Not until we know whether Hale acted alone or on behalf of someone with access to the estate." "We," she repeated. "He turned from the window, and I did not save your life to deliver you back to the people trying to end it." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a cascade of sparks upward into the chimney's dark throat. In the sudden flare of light, Eleanor saw something on his face that she had not expected. Not duty, not reluctance, but a quiet, unshakable resolve. The expression of a man who had made a decision and would hold to it regardless of cost. She did not yet understand what that expression would come to mean to her. She would, in time, come to understand that it meant everything. The first night passed in careful, deliberate distance. Thomas gave her the cot and positioned himself on the floor near the door, with his back against the wall and his knife within reach. He did not sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep had become a negotiation rather than a surrender, something his body resisted and his mind sabotaged with images he could not control. But tonight, the wakefulness had a different quality. It was watchful rather than anguished. He had something to guard. In the grey light before dawn, he heard her breathing change and knew she was awake. "I should tell you," she said to the ceiling, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I am engaged to be married." Thomas stared at the embers. "I did not ask." "No, but it seemed relevant given the circumstances." "Your engagement has no bearing on the circumstances. You are in danger. I am able to help. That is the whole of it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "His name is Lord Pembroke. The arrangement was made by my father. I have met him 4 times. Thomas said nothing. "He collects snuff boxes," she added, and there was something in her voice, not bitterness, not quite, but a weariness that seemed too old for her years. "He has 214 snuff boxes, and he once described each of them to me over the course of a single dinner." Thomas felt something dangerous stir at the corner of his mouth. He suppressed it. "I am certain Lord Pembroke is a man of many qualities," he said. "He is a man of 214 snuff boxes." The sound that escaped him was not quite a laugh. It was closer to the memory of one. Rusty, unaccustomed, surprising to them both. In the dim light, Eleanor turned her head on the pillow and looked at him. He looked away. This was the moment. though neither recognized it, when the architecture of what would follow began to take shape, not in a glance or a touch or a declaration, but in a sound. The almost laugh of a man who had forgotten he was capable of it, drawn out of him by a woman who had no idea what she had done. The days that followed established a rhythm that was, by any rational measure, impossible. A duke's daughter, raised in a 60-room estate with a staff of 40, now occupied a one-room cabin with a wounded soldier who owned a single cup. The absurdity of it should have been unbearable. Instead, it became something else. Something that neither of them had a vocabulary for, because the language they had each been taught did not contain words for this particular kind of existence. Thomas left at first light each morning to scout the surrounding forest, checking for signs that the remaining assassins had tracked them. He set snares, gathered water from the stream, checked the perimeter he had established using techniques learned in the peninsula. Tripwires of fishing line attached to tin cups filled with pebbles, positioned at the 4 approaches to the cabin. Crude, but effective. A soldier's ingenuity applied to a lover's, no, to a protector's purpose. Eleanor, for her part, refused to be idle. On the second morning, Thomas returned to find that she had swept the floor with a bundle of birch twigs, reorganized his meager shelf of provisions, and was attempting to mend a tear in his second shirt with a needle she had found in his kit. The stitches were uneven, her fingers clearly unaccustomed to the work, but she held the fabric with a concentration that suggested she was mending something far more significant than linen. "You do not have to do that," he said from the doorway. "I am aware. That shirt is more patch than cloth. It is beyond saving." "Most things that appear beyond saving," she said, not looking up, "are merely beyond the willingness of others to try." He stood in the doorway for longer than was necessary, watching her fingers move, and then he went to clean the rabbits he had caught, because there was nothing else he could do with the feeling that had lodged itself beneath his sternum like a second musket ball, except this one he suspected no surgeon could remove. They spoke carefully at first. The subjects were practical. Firewood, water, the weather, the movements he had observed in the forest. But practicality has a limited supply, and by the third evening, with rain hammering against the thatch and the fire burning low and golden, the conversation began to migrate toward more dangerous territory. She asked him about the war. He told her very little, which told her everything. He asked her about her life at Ashworth Park. She described it with a precision that was, he slowly realized, the precision of someone cataloguing the dimensions of a beautiful cage. "I have been presented at court," she said, tracing the rim of the teacup. They now shared it, taking turns, a ritual that had developed without discussion. "I have attended 47 balls. I have been introduced to every eligible man of suitable rank within a 200-mile radius of London. I have been taught to play the pianoforte, to paint watercolours, to speak French passably and Italian poorly, to arrange flowers, to manage a household I have never been permitted to manage, and to smile in a manner that suggests contentment without implying excessive enthusiasm. That is a great deal of smiling. It is exhausting." Thomas looked at the fire. I would not know. I have not had much cause." She studied his profile in the firelight. The strong line of his jaw, the scar that ran along his temple and disappeared into his hairline, the way his damaged shoulder hunched slightly forward, as though still bracing for impact. He was not handsome in the way that London understood handsomeness. He was something more unsettling than that. He was real. "You are smiling now," she said softly. He was. He stopped. "Do not," she said, and there was an urgency in her voice that startled them both. "Do not stop." The rain intensified. The fire crackled. Thomas Alder did not smile again that evening, but something in his expression remained altered. A softening around the eyes, a loosening of the jaw, as though a door that had been sealed shut for 3 years had been opened just enough to let in a sliver of light. On the 4th day, Thomas ventured further than usual, following tracks he had discovered at the southern edge of his territory. 2 men, moving in careful formation. They had not yet found the cabin, but they were searching systematically. He estimated 3 days, perhaps 4, before their grid pattern brought them close enough. He returned at dusk and found Eleanor standing at the edge of the clearing, her face lifted toward the sky. The last light of the day caught in her hair, turning it the color of dark honey, and she was so still, so perfectly composed against the backdrop of ancient oaks and evening cloud, that for a moment he could not breathe. She turned at his approach, and whatever she saw on his face made her expression change. "They are close," she said. It was not a question. 3 days, perhaps less. She nodded. Then she said something that rearranged every assumption Thomas had made about who she was and what she wanted. "Teach me to use the knife." He blinked. "I am not asking to become a soldier," she continued, her chin lifting in a gesture he was coming to recognize as the precursor to an argument she had already decided to win. "I am asking to not be helpless. I have been helpless my entire life. I have been dressed and directed and displayed and protected by men who made decisions about my safety without consulting me. I will not do it anymore. Not here. Not with you." The last 2 words landed differently than the rest. He heard them and understood that she had separated him from every other man she had known. From her father, from Lord Pembroke, from the society that treated her as a porcelain figure to be placed on the appropriate shelf. She was telling him that she expected something different from him, that she believed he was capable of providing it. It was the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to him, and Thomas Alder had once stood in a line of infantry facing a cavalry charge. He taught her to use the knife. He stood behind her, demonstrating the grip, the stance, the angle of attack. Practical, clinical, the way he might have taught a young recruit, except that young recruits did not smell of lavender and rain. Young recruits did not have a pulse that he could see beating in the hollow of their throat. Young recruits did not turn their heads at a proximity that brought their lips within inches of his jaw and ask, in a voice that was entirely too steady, "Like this?" "Yes," he said, and stepped away, and busied himself with firewood for longer than any fire had ever required. That night, they sat on opposite sides of the cabin, as they always did. She on the cot, he on the floor by the door. and the distance between them had never felt shorter. "Thomas," she said. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. The sound of it in her voice did something to the atmosphere of the room that was almost alchemical, changed its composition, its temperature, its capacity to sustain the careful pretense they had both been maintaining. "You should sleep," he said. "I cannot. Try." "I have been trying. For 4 nights I have been trying, and instead I lie here and listen to you not sleeping either. And I think—" She stopped. The silence that followed was so charged that the fire seemed to lean toward it. "What do you think?" he asked, and regretted the question immediately, because he could hear in his own voice how much the answer mattered. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have never in my life been as frightened as I am now. But the fear has nothing to do with the men in the forest." Thomas closed his eyes. "Eleanor, I know what you are going to say. That I am confused, that the situation has created a false intimacy, that gratitude and proximity have combined to produce a feeling that will not survive the return to ordinary life. Is that not the truth? It may be. I do not know. But I know that in 4 days, in this cabin, with nothing but firelight and conversation and the sound of rain, I have felt more like myself than in 23 years of ballrooms and drawing rooms and the company of men who saw only my father's title when they looked at me." Her voice held steady, but her hands gripping the edge of the cot did not. "You do not see the title, Thomas. I am not certain what you see, but it is not that." He was quiet for a very long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough with the effort of restraint. "I see a woman who crossed a forest in one shoe without making a sound, who mends shirts she has no obligation to mend, who asks to learn the knife rather than wait to be rescued, who makes me laugh when I had forgotten the mechanism of it." He paused. The fire made small, desperate sounds. "I see you, Eleanor, and that is precisely the problem." "Why is it a problem?" "Because you are the daughter of a duke, and I am a man who owns 1 cup. I do not care about the cup. The world cares about the cup. Your world cares about the cup. Then perhaps my world is wrong." He opened his eyes and looked at her across the room, across the impossible distance of 12 feet and an entire social order. And what passed between them in that look was not a declaration, because declarations are easy, but an acknowledgement of what existed, of what could not, by any rational assessment, be allowed to exist, of the extraordinary cruelty of a world that had conspired to place these 2 particular people in this one room and then erected every conceivable barrier between them. "You should sleep," he said again. "Thomas, please." The word was barely audible. It cost him more than anything he had said in 3 years. She heard the cost and fell silent, and the cabin settled around them like a held breath. On the 5th day, he told her the truth about his past. They were sitting by the stream that ran 50 yards east of the cabin. The afternoon was warm for late autumn, and the light filtered through the remaining leaves in patterns that shifted and reformed like thoughts not yet fully committed to. Eleanor was washing the teacup, their teacup, and Thomas was watching the water and the words came out of him the way water comes from a cracked vessel. Not in a rush, but in a slow, steady, unstoppable seep. He had been a sergeant in the 48th Regiment of Foot. He had fought at Vittoria, at the Nivelle, at Orthez. He had been competent, dependable, respected by his men. None of these qualities had been enough to prevent the musket ball at Toulouse, nor the infection that followed, nor the discharge that came after. A piece of paper that thanked him for his service to the Crown, and sent him home to a country that had no use for damaged soldiers, and even less interest in the damage itself. He had returned to find his mother dead, and the family cottage sold to pay her debts. He had no trade that did not require two functional arms. He had no connections, no patron, no claim to anyone's attention. He had drifted for months. London, then the countryside, then deeper into the countryside, until he had found this cabin, abandoned and falling apart, and had recognized in it something kindred. "I rebuilt it," he said, slowly. One-handed mostly. The vicar helped with the roof, and the blacksmith's boy carried stone. It took the better part of a year, and when it was done I thought, this is enough. This quiet, this solitude, this will be enough. Eleanor set the teacup on the grass between them. Was it? He looked at her. The afternoon light was in her eyes, turning them the colour of autumn itself. Not one shade, but many. Shifting. Alive. It was, he said, until 5 days ago. She did not move toward him. He did not move toward her. But the space between them, the space that they had been so carefully maintaining, measuring, respecting, changed its nature. It was no longer a distance. It was a choice. And they were both aware, with the terrible clarity that comes only in moments of genuine emotional danger, that the choice was becoming more difficult to sustain with every passing hour. That evening, Eleanor made a decision that she announced with the same calm authority with which she might have ordered a carriage. "I am not leaving." Thomas was sharpening the knife by the fire, his hand stilled. "When this is resolved," she continued, "when the men have been dealt with, and the conspiracy exposed, and my father's house made safe, I am not going back." "You do not mean that." "I mean it with every part of myself that I have only just discovered exists." She stood and crossed the room, not to him, but to the window, where she looked out at the darkening trees with an expression of such fierce, quiet determination that it seemed to alter the very composition of her face. "I have spent my entire life being appropriate. Appropriate dress, appropriate speech, appropriate feelings. I have been appropriate to the point of disappearance. And in 5 days, in this cabin with you, I have become visible. To you, to myself." She turned. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I understand that you are telling me something that cannot be." "Why? Because of rank? Because of money? Because society has decided that the content of a person's character matters less than the accident of their birth? Because you deserve. Do not." Her voice was quiet, but carried an edge that could have cut glass. "Do not tell me what I deserve. Men have been telling me what I deserve my entire life, and it has amounted to a fiancé who collects snuff boxes, and a drawing room with a view of a garden I am not permitted to walk in without a chaperone. If that is what I deserve, then I reject the premise." Thomas set down the knife. He looked at her standing by the window, backlit by the last of the daylight. Her borrowed shawl, his shawl, wrapped around her shoulders, her feet bare on the stone floor, her hair falling loose because there were no pins in this cabin, no maids, no mirrors, nothing but the essential truth of two people who had stumbled into each other's orbits and found there a gravity they could not escape. "I have nothing to give you," he said. "You have given me more in 5 days than anyone has given me in 23 years. Eleanor? A cabin, a fire, a cup of tea, honesty. The sound of your voice saying my name as though it belongs to an actual person rather than a title. The feeling of being seen." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and the crack undid him more completely than anything she had said before it. He stood. He crossed the room. He stopped 1 step away from her, close enough to see the firelight reflected in her eyes, close enough to feel the warmth that radiated from her skin, close enough that his hand, if he raised it, could have touched her face. He did not raise it. "If I touch you," he said, and his voice was not steady, was not even close to steady, was the voice of a man holding the last line against an advancing force. "I will not be able to stop. Not touching you, not wanting this, not wanting you. And when you go back, because you will go back, because the world will demand it, I will be left here with the memory of it, and it will be worse than any wound I have ever received." She looked up at him. A tear had escaped from her right eye, and was making its way down her cheek with the slow inevitability of something that had been a long time coming. "And if I stay," she whispered, "then I will spend every day for the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." Neither moved. The fire burned. The wind pressed against the shutters. The world beyond the cabin walls continued its indifferent rotation, carrying with it all the rules and expectations and impossible distances that separated a duke's daughter from a soldier with nothing. But inside the cabin, in the space between two people who were not touching, but whose souls had abandoned all pretense of distance, something was being built, something that had no name in the language of drawing rooms and ballrooms, no precedent in the careful architecture of English society, no permission from any authority that either of them had been raised to respect. It was, Thomas thought, the most beautiful and most terrifying structure he had ever inhabited. The morning of the 6th day brought the crisis they had both been expecting. Thomas heard the tin cups rattle just after dawn. The southern perimeter, 200 yards out. He was on his feet and at the window before the sound had finished, every instinct honed by years of warfare, surging back into his body like blood, returning to a numb limb. "Stay inside," he said, taking the knife and moving toward the door. "Bolt it behind me." Eleanor caught his arm, his damaged arm. He felt her fingers close around the scarred muscle above his elbow, and the sensation, half pain, half something far more acute, stopped him in his tracks. "Come back," she said. It was not a request. It was not a plea. It was a command, issued with the full authority of a woman who had discovered that she possessed a will of iron, and was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. "I will," he said. He went into the forest and became, for the first time in 3 years, the thing the army had made him. Silent, precise, deadly in the way that damaged men can be deadly when they have something behind them that they cannot bear to lose. He found them an hour later. 2 men, the remaining assassins, moving through the undergrowth with the careful tread of professionals. They were well armed. Pistols, short swords. The equipment of men who expected their work to require close contact. Thomas did not give them the opportunity for close contact. He used the forest itself, the terrain he had memorized over 2 years of solitary habitation. He led the first man into a ravine where the footing was treacherous, then dropped on him from above. The second, hearing his companions fall, turned and fired his pistol into the trees. The ball went wide by 3 feet. Thomas did not. When it was finished, he stood in the silence of the forest and felt nothing. This was the soldier's curse, the ability to do terrible, necessary things and feel nothing at all in the doing of them. The feeling would come later. It always did. In the dark, in the space between wakefulness and sleep. In the trembling hands that he would press flat against his thighs and will into stillness. But not now. Now, there was a woman in a cabin who had told him to come back, and he intended to obey. He returned covered in mud and scratches, with a cut along his forearm that was bleeding but not deep. Eleanor opened the door before he reached it. She had been watching from the window, and the expression on her face when she saw him was something that Thomas knew he would carry for the rest of his life, regardless of what that life contained. She did not throw her arms around him. She did not weep. She looked at him with a steadiness that matched his own. And then she looked at the cut on his arm. And then she turned and walked to the shelf where the medicinal supplies were kept. A tin of salve, a strip of clean cloth. And she set about attending the wound with hands that did not shake. "The men," she said, wrapping the cloth around his forearm with careful, precise movements. "They will not trouble you again." She tied off the bandage. Her fingers lingered on his wrist. His pulse beat against her fingertips, and she could feel it. Fast, strong, alive. "There will be others," she said. "If the conspiracy reaches into my father's house, there will be others. Then we must reach your father before they do." She looked up at him. "We? I told you, I did not save your life to deliver me back to the people trying to end it. Yes, you said that." A pause. "But this is different now, Thomas. This is not protection. This is something else." He knew what it was. He had known since the 4th night, or perhaps since the 1st, or perhaps since the moment she had looked at him in the forest with that expression of terrified calculation and decided to run with him rather than from him. "Yes," he said, "it is something else." The journey to Ashworth Park took 2 days on foot. Thomas knew paths through the forest and the adjoining countryside that no carriage road followed. Drovers' tracks, poachers' trails, ancient rights of way that predated the enclosures and persisted in the landscape like veins in aging skin. They moved carefully, resting in sheltered hollows during the day. travelling in the grey hours of dawn and dusk, when visibility favoured those who knew the terrain. They spoke little during the travel. The physical demands of the journey consumed most of their energy, and what remained was occupied by a watchfulness that had less to do with external danger and more to do with the internal landscape they were both navigating. The uncharted territory between what they felt and what they were permitted to feel. On the second evening, sheltering in the ruins of an old stone barn, with the stars visible through gaps in the roof and the smell of hay and cold earth surrounding them, Eleanor spoke. "When we arrive," she said, "my father will want to know who you are. I am no one, a former soldier, a man who happened to be in the right forest at the right time. You are more than that. To your father, I will not be." She was quiet. The truth of this settled between them like frost, beautiful in its clarity, painful in its implications. "I will tell him the truth," she said finally. "Which truth?" "All of it." Thomas shook his head. "If you tell him what has grown between us, he will see me as a threat. A man of no rank who has spent 6 days alone with his daughter. Do you understand what that means in his world? He will not see a protector. He will see a scandal. Then let him. Eleanor." He turned to face her. In the starlight, her features were reduced to their essential lines. The curve of her jaw, the dark sweep of her lashes, the mouth that had said things to him that no one had ever said, that no one in his life had thought him worth saying. "I would endure any scandal for you, but I will not be the cause of your ruin. If we do this, if we pursue what is between us, it must be done in a way that protects you, your reputation, your safety, your future." "My future," she said, and the word carried a weight that was almost architectural. "Everyone speaks of my future as though it is a building that has already been designed, and I am merely expected to move into it. What if I wish to be the architect?" He had no answer for this that did not involve taking her face in his hands and showing her, with something more honest than words, exactly what she had come to mean to him. So he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent patterns. And two people who had found each other against every probability sat in the ruins of a stone barn and practiced the excruciating discipline of restraint. Ashworth Park appeared on the morning of the 7th day, like something from a different world, which, Thomas reflected, it was. A sprawling Jacobean manor set in 200 acres of manicured parkland, with a facade of warm stone that seemed to glow in the autumn light, fountains, formal gardens, a stable block larger than most villages, the accumulated wealth and power of generations made visible in brick and mortar and carefully trimmed hedgerow. Thomas stopped at the tree line. Eleanor stopped beside him. "This is your home," he said. "This is my father's house," she corrected gently. "I am no longer certain they are the same thing." They approached from the east, avoiding the main drive, and Thomas's caution proved justified when they spotted two men stationed near the gatehouse who did not wear the Whitcomb livery. Eleanor identified them as strangers. The conspiracy, whatever its full dimensions, had indeed reached into the estate itself. What followed was, in Thomas's professional assessment, a military operation conducted with minimal resources and maximum improvisation. He used the servant's entrance, identified by Eleanor, to access the house. He located the Duke in his private study, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire life being obeyed. And he presented himself with the only currency he possessed, the truth. He told the Duke about the assassination attempt, about Hale's betrayal, about the men in the forest and the men at the gate. He provided tactical assessments, physical descriptions, and the locations of the bodies he had left in the woods, which could be recovered and examined for evidence. He did not tell the Duke about the cabin, about the conversations, about the way his daughter looked in firelight, about the teacup they had shared, or the almost laugh, or the night when 12 feet of cabin floor had felt like both an ocean and a threshold. The Duke listened. When Thomas finished, the older man regarded him with an expression that was difficult to pass. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more calculating. The assessment of a man who understood power and was trying to determine where this unexpected stranger fit within its architecture. "You are the man who saved my daughter's life," the Duke said. "I am the man who was nearby when she needed help. She saved her own life in several respects." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that a man of Thomas's station would speak of his daughter as an agent rather than a victim. "What do you want?" the Duke asked. "Money? A position? Name your price." Thomas looked at the Duke of Ashworth, looked at the study filled with its leather-bound books and oil paintings and centuries of inherited certainty, and he thought of his cabin, of the single cup, of the woman who had said she preferred it. "I want nothing, Your Grace. I came to return your daughter safely, and to warn you of the danger within your household. Both are accomplished. I will take my leave." He bowed, a soldier's bow, economical and precise, and turned to go. Wait! It was not the Duke who spoke. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She had changed. Someone had provided her with clean clothes, proper shoes, pins for her hair. She looked once again like the daughter of a duke. The transformation should have confirmed everything Thomas believed about the distance between them. Instead, it broke his heart, because he could see beneath the silk and the careful coiffure the woman who had mended his shirt, the woman who had learned to hold a knife, the woman who had stood at a window and declared herself visible. "Father," she said, and her voice was the voice of an architect. "We need to talk." Thomas did not hear the conversation that followed. He waited in the servants' hall, drinking tea from a porcelain cup that felt wrong in his hand. Too light, too smooth, too much like something that belonged in a world he had never been part of and would never be invited into. An hour passed, then two. A footman brought him food, which he ate without tasting. A maid offered to tend the cut on his arm, which had begun to bleed through Eleanor's bandage. He declined. When the study door finally opened, it was Eleanor who emerged. She walked down the corridor toward him with a pace that was neither rushed nor hesitant, and when she reached him, she stopped. "My father has dismissed Mr. Hale," she said. "He is sending word to the magistrate and to his contacts in London. The conspiracy will be investigated. The men at the gate have been removed." Thomas nodded. "Good. Then you are safe. I have also ended my engagement to Lord Pembroke." Thomas's hand tightened around the porcelain cup. "And I have told my father," she continued, "that the man who saved my life is the man I intend to marry." The cup did not break. Thomas set it down very carefully on the table beside him and stood. What did he say? He said it was impossible. He said it was a fantasy born of gratitude and proximity. He said I would be ruined. He said no man of breeding would accept me after such a scandal. He is correct. He is not finished. A faint luminous smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. The smile of a woman who has just won an argument she was never supposed to enter. He also said that no man of breeding has ever saved his daughter's life, rebuilt a cabin with one hand, or had the decency to refuse a reward when offered one. He said these things do not count for nothing, even in England. She paused. He is not happy, Thomas. He may never be happy about it, but he is a man who understands courage, and he recognizes it in you. Thomas looked at her. She looked back at him. The corridor was empty. The light from the tall windows fell between them in geometric patterns on the marble floor. And beyond the glass, the parkland stretched in its immaculate green toward a horizon that seemed, for the first time, to include him. "I own a cabin," he said. "One room, a fire, a cot, a shelf with 4 books. 5, she said. "I left mine." He blinked. "You, when?" "The morning you went to deal with the men. I placed it on your shelf, between the volume of military history and the collection of verse." She lifted her chin. "I wanted to leave something of myself behind, in case—" She stopped. "In case I did not come back." "Yes." The distance between them contracted, not physically. They remained apart, as propriety demanded, in a corridor of a duke's house where any servant might pass. But in every other dimension, the space collapsed entirely. And Thomas understood, with the certainty of a man who has survived battles and fever, and the long grey aftermath of both, that this was the choice. The meaningful choice. Not whether to fight or to flee, not whether to risk or to retreat, but whether to accept that he deserved this. This woman, this improbable, impossible, extraordinary chance at a life that contained more than survival. "The cabin will need a second chair," he said. "Yes. And another cup. Yes. And someone to tell me when I am being stubborn. You are being stubborn now, am I? You are standing there cataloguing furniture, when what you should be doing is telling me that you will spend every day for the rest of your life trying to be worthy of this. I believe those were your words." He had said that, in the cabin, on the night when the fire burned low and the world outside had ceased to exist. He had offered it as a hypothetical, a conditional statement attached to an impossible future. But the future, it turned out, was not impossible. It was merely improbable, and improbable things, Thomas had learned, happened all the time. In forests, in cabins, in the space between two people who should never have met, and having met, could not bear to be parted. "Every day," he said, "for the rest of my life." She smiled, not the practiced smile of a duke's daughter, calibrated for drawing rooms and afternoon calls. A real smile, the kind that transformed her entire face and made the corridor brighter, and made Thomas Alder feel, for the first time since a surgeon with whiskey on his breath had told him his soldiering days were done, that he was not broken, that he was, in fact, exactly sufficient. "Then I suggest," Eleanor said, "that we begin." The wedding took place 3 months later, in the small chapel at Ashworth Park, on a morning when frost covered the ground, and the light through the stained glass fell in colours that neither of them would ever be able to see again without remembering. It was attended by the Duke, who gave his daughter away with an expression of bewildered resignation that would, over the years, soften into something approaching pride. By the vicar who had helped Thomas repair his roof, by the blacksmith's boy, now a young man who had carried stone, by a small assembly of villagers and tenants who did not entirely understand how a duke's daughter had come to marry a wounded soldier, but who recognized in the way they looked at each other something that required no explanation. Eleanor wore white. Thomas wore the coat he had mended so many times it was more repair than original fabric, though Eleanor had insisted on adding new buttons. Small, silver, polished until they caught the light. They returned to the cabin that evening. Thomas had added the second chair, and the second cup, and a small shelf for Eleanor's growing collection of books, which would, over the years, expand until it occupied an entire wall, and eventually necessitated an addition to the cabin itself. A second room, built by Thomas with assistance from the estate carpenter, because the Duke, despite his initial reservations, had come to understand that his daughter's happiness was located not in the ballrooms of London, but in a clearing in a Hertfordshire forest, in the company of a man who saw her. The fire burned, the wind moved through the trees. Eleanor sat in her chair with a book in her lap, and Thomas sat in his, with the knife he no longer needed resting on the table between them. And the silence that filled the cabin was not the silence of solitude. It was the silence of two people who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to say that had not already been said in the language of shared cups and mended shirts, and the courage it takes to stay when every rule of the world demands that you leave. Outside, the forest stretched in all directions, dark and deep, and indifferent to the affairs of men. But inside the cabin, the light was warm, and it was enough, and it was everything.